Hey, Piro. I'm glad that you brought up physical law because I think the basis of Nick's argument that there is no I and no will whatsoever comes from two realizations on his part, or two assumptions. The first is the nature of physical law, cause and effect, and so forth, and the second is his own experience of being alive. Um, Now, let's start with physical law first. He thinks that science is basically proven, or that it's a foregone conclusion now that all of matter behaves mechanically and deterministically, and that there's no room for any mental will to intervene in this causal process. Now, of course, so many of us still think of um, the relation between our experience and the physical world in terms of these Cartesian substances of mind and matter, and I think it's troublesome to continue to operate within such a substance dualism when we think of matter as a substance and mind as a different substance. There's really nowhere to go with that because there's no way to figure out how these two substances interact, which is Nick's point. The only solution is to say that mind doesn't exist. But then, of course, we're left with this, the stubborn existence of our experience of being a physical body and the seemingness of our decision making processes, the seemingness or the appearance of our ability to make choices. And I think this is why so many are confused by what Nick is trying to say. But to get back to physical law for a second, you say that physical law explains reality, whereas I would say physical law is one description we can give of reality. To say that it explains reality, I think, goes too far because that implies that all of reality can be reduced to one type of causality, to efficient causality, to mechanical causality. When I think if we want to actually explain any particular observation in reality, we need to employ at least four different types of causality or four reasons that this observation or this thing in reality occurred the way it did. Um, there's the material cause, which is really not only what is the thing made of, but what is its origin, or at least within modern cosmology, we see that matter is not a substance. Matter is a process of becoming, an energetic, dynamic process of becoming. There weren't always atoms. Atoms had to emerge from the quantum flux of energy that existed just after the Big Bang, and matter is continuing to evolve 13.7 billion years later. It's not this fixed mechanical substance. Now, of course, efficient causation is still real. There are mechanical causes and effects in the natural world, um, but there are also material, as I said, and formal causes and final causes. Formal causes are what allows organisms to form this pattern, which in the case of a living organism, the pattern is greater than the sum of its parts. The wholeness of my body as an organism is organized in such a way that you can't merely reduce it to the mechanical sum of the interaction of its parts, because the parts each work for the sake of maintaining the holistic structure of my entire body. And so you can't begin with the parts and never arrive at the whole. The whole is the reason the parts are structured and interact with one another in the way that they do. And then final causation, of course, is what Nick has an issue with, the idea that nature can act for an end, or that any system within nature could act for an end. Um, and certainly when we get to the level of biology, it's without doubt obvious that organisms have certain purposes in mind. They want to survive, they want to eat, they want to reproduce, and so forth. When you get to the level of the human organism, we want to express, we want to understand, we want to know. So there's all this teleological um, drivenness in life. They can't be reduced away, I don't think. Um, But even at the level of physics, when we talk about the second law of thermodynamics, which is that all systems tend towards disorder, or entropy rules ultimately, this is a teleological principle, that there is a movement from a state of order to disorder. And you can't understand that without employing some type of finality or final causation. Um, so physical law, by which I think you implied just mechanical causation, is only one particular way of describing reality, and I don't think we can reduce the whole of reality to simply mechanical causation. There are all these other types of causes and reasons that any entity or system or event can happen that we have to take into consideration if we want to explain it. A simple physical description is not a complete explanation, in other words. And so on the physical aspect of things, that I think is what originally led Nick to think that there was no possibility of a will operating within us, is, I think he's misguided on that account. Now, in terms of our own experience of an identity, I think he's onto something, that there is no fixed solid mental substance, just as there's no fixed solid physical substance. There's no mental substance that endures just as it is throughout our entire lives, which is why this mental-physical duality is just useless nowadays. Our experience is influenced by what's around us, and we are conditioned, certainly from the moment we're born. Even before we're born, we're handed certain genes that are conditioned from hundreds of thousands of millions of billions of years prior to our birth. So our existence is conditioned at the most basic level, but at the same time, because of these other kinds of causation I described, especially final causation, we do have the ability to exert an influence on the world around us. Our organism has some degree of autonomy in relation to its environment, though it's never been separate, nor can it ever be separate from its environment. There's still this reciprocal exchange between organism and the environment, such that the organism has some measure of autonomy. Though identity, I think, is where Nick is onto something, that we don't have a solid fixed identity. So to say that I, Matthew, do something or am responsible for what happens, okay, I push a button, a key on my computer right now, okay, well, Matthew 3 seconds ago was responsible for that, but the identity which I now exist as is not the same as the identity that pushed the button. And so I think that's where Nick is pointing at, in order to say that we really don't do anything. We aren't responsible for any willful actions, because our identity, after we've willed anything, has already changed. But this doesn't mean that there is no will. It just means that the identity responsible for willing is constantly changing and developing due to its own acts, as well as the response it gets from its environment. So that's probably all a mouthful, but hopefully I made a little bit of sense. So thanks for listening, and let me know what you think.